something unseen beat its fists against the nearest door. Red masking tape had been used to draw a large X across the surface. "I need you to trust me," she hissed to Doran. He gave her a crooked smile.
"I always have."
"When I say go, unlock that door and open it." Claire left him beside the occupied room and jogged along the hallway. Ezra must have already searched the space. Doors stood open, exposing sterile meeting rooms and abandoned lecture halls. Inside the second conference room, she found a fire extinguisher, half hidden behind a dead potted fern. She wrenched it out of its holder and removed its safety pin as she returned to the hallway. Doran waited beside the door. Claire paused behind him to listen. The footsteps were drawing closer. Close enough, she thought. She nodded to Doran. He nodded back, then turned the lock and pulled the door open. Chapter 56. A hulking, misshapen creature spilled into the hallway. Drooping, pendulous flaps of skin pooled over each other, swinging as the hollow turned toward Claire. She had just enough time to see its beady eyes flash red in the exit light, then she pulled on the extinguisher's handle. White foam exploded across the creature. It bellowed, a deep, reverberating tone that shook the air around them. Claire moved a step nearer, the extinguisher shuddering in her hands, and the hollow's howl intensified as it retreated. Claire knew the monster had spent most of a month in isolation, and she'd hoped the sudden stimulus would be too much for it to cope with. Her gamble paid off. The hollow staggered toward the stairs, and Claire followed it. As they neared the top step, Claire lifted the extinguisher and slammed its base into the hollow's chest. The creature howled as it fell down the stairs. Horrible crackling noises rose as its fragile bones broke. Claire stepped back, breathing more heavily than she'd expected, and stopped at Doran's side. A surprised cry rose from Ezra. Claire closed her eyes, half of her praying the strategy would work, the other half dreading it. A gunshot echoed from the landing below, followed by a second. Claire waited. She was greeted by silence. "One bullet to kill Peter, 2 bullets chasing us out of the lab, another 2 to kill the hollow. He should have 1 left." "Up," Claire whispered, dropping the fire extinguisher. "We need to find another hollow." Doran followed her onto the stairs. New noises rose from the lower floor. Ezra swearing. The hollow had upset him. Good. Her legs burned, and her chest ached from where she'd been hit, but Claire didn't slow down. The hollow hadn't stalled Ezra for long. They stopped at the 15th floor, and Claire slunk forward, listening. She couldn't find any red tape on the doors. The floor was silent. Doran gave her a short nod, his hair shining in the red light, and they turned back to the stairs. Claire could no longer hear Ezra's footsteps below them. That worried her. They took the next 2 flights in long strides. The stairs ended in a narrow foyer with windows on either side. Harsh lightning illuminated the room in sporadic, painful flashes. A single door stood in front of Claire. It looked familiar. She turned and saw a solid wall where the stairs were supposed to continue. They had reached the highest floor. She pressed a hand over her mouth as she tried to swallow the overwhelming sense of panic. They were cornered. There was nowhere to hide on the highest level, and no hollows, just the maintenance room. They would be sitting ducks. "Back down," she hissed. She didn't know if they had time to make it to the floor below before Ezra caught up to them, or what they would need to do once they reached it. She just knew that they needed to keep moving. She fought to keep her footsteps light so she would hear Ezra's approach before he was on them. As they neared the landing, she pressed her shoulder against the wall and leaned forward to glimpse around the corner. There was no sign of Ezra, either on the stairs or in the hallway. The level was suspiciously quiet. Maybe he realized we were trapped. Maybe he's hiding around a corner, waiting for our inevitable retreat. A point-blank shot. He only had 1 bullet left, though. He couldn't hit both of them. Claire put her hand against Doran's chest, pushing him back behind her as she slunk around the corner. The next flight of stairs was empty. She moved silently, holding her breath, straining to hear any human noises, the rustle of a jacket, the squeak of a shoe, a breath. The storm continued to rage around them, drowning out any of the subtler noises.
Claire.
Doran's hand fell on her shoulder, halting her.
I hear something.
She frowned, listening. She could hear the storm. She could hear creaks as the wind's pressure made the metal tower sway. She could hear drumming rain. What is it? He leaned close, his breathless voice in her ear.
Mechanical, I think. It blends into the thunder, but it is something different.
Claire took another step. She was nearly at the carpet. A faint light blinked at the other end of the hall. She hadn't seen that light before, and it took her a second to realize where it came from. He brought the elevators back online. Ezra had realized they could outmatch him in speed, so he'd taken that advantage away. But it gave Claire an opportunity. She grabbed Doran's arm. We need to shut off the power, quickly. He turned back toward the stairs, Claire following closely behind. She could make out the mechanical noises of the elevator gears turning as it drew closer. They skidded around the corner and onto the highest floor. The door to the maintenance room was locked, but it was only made of wood. Doran lifted his foot and kicked. The wood cracked as it splintered, and when he kicked it again, the door burst inward, the lock left embedded in the doorframe with a halo of broken wood.
Get the lights.
He was already fumbling for the lids on the generator. Claire felt for the switches beside the door and turned them. Rows of lights blinked on overhead. Doran bent over the generator, his face full of hard angles and his hands buried inside the machine. The lights stayed on for all of 2 seconds before they died with a long, drawn-out whine as the power drained out of the building. The darkness was oppressive. Claire closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time they'd visited the highest floor. Ezra had brought a flashlight. After fixing the generator, he'd placed the flashlight on the workbench, and she didn't remember him picking it up again after that. Claire moved toward the surface, clipped her hip on the edge of a pipe, and hissed.
Claire?
Just a moment. She found the bench and ran her hands across the surface. Her fingers found something cylindrical and cold. Light exploded around them as she turned the flashlight on. I think we're okay. She moved back toward Doran, her ears trained on the lower level. I think we cut the power before he could open the elevator doors. He'll be trapped in there until we turn the power back on.
Good.
Doran turned so that his back was against the generator and slid to the ground. He exhaled deeply as his long legs stretched out. Claire dropped down beside him. She finally had a chance to get a good look at him, and what she saw filled her with quiet dread. Blood ran from his nose and lips, though it was already drying. It was tacky in his hair, too. He'd taken on an awful gray shade. His beautiful eyes were deeply shadowed and duller than she was used to. Claire ran her fingertips across his cheek as gently as she could, and he leaned into the touch. Does it hurt?
No.
There was an undercurrent in how he carried himself that made her think he was lying. Oh, Doran. She trailed her fingers over his chin, where the blood had cracked. What did he do to you? Doran closed his eyes. He looked exhausted.
Don't worry about that. We just need to find a way out of the tower.
Claire bit her lip and turned the flashlight across the space, scanning the room. Ezra seemed to have spent a lot of time up there, probably trying to keep the generator running. Bottles of water lay discarded on benches, along with thick manuals and open boxes of supplies. If we can find his computers and figure out how to activate the lights and alarms, we might be able to leave while he's trapped in the elevator. Her stomach coiled. Leaving Ezra to starve might be even crueler than unleashing hollows on him. Claire tried to balance her perspective as her mind, panicked, darted between ideas. Ezra would probably figure out how to get out of the elevators. She just hoped that wouldn't happen too quickly. Doran suddenly moved. He bent over, facing away from her, and retched. The flashlight's beam picked up bright red blood pooling over the ground, and Claire clutched at her throat. "Doran?" He held up a hand, asking her to wait. The fingers shook. "Please, Doran, please hold on." The panic was rising like a tsunami. She didn't know what had happened to him, and there was precious little she could do to help. She couldn't even give him time to rest. Each minute inside Alexis was an extra minute Ezra would be working on opening the elevator. Leaving the tower was only one issue. Even if they figured that out, Claire didn't know what they would do afterward. Doran wouldn't be able to run much farther, or even walk. She wasn't strong enough to carry him. Blocked roads meant not even a car could help. She felt like she was being pressed in on all sides, with no routes to escape. Doran slumped back against the generator. The muscles in his face were slack. "He's dehydrated. That, at least, is something I can help." Claire crossed to the bottle she'd seen on the bench. She found an unopened one and broke the seal as she returned to her companion. "Doran?" She crawled to his side, afraid to touch him in case she somehow made him worse. "We have water. It might help." His eyes cracked open.
Thank you.
"Shh, don't try to talk. We'll be okay. Oh. Claire wanted to promise him she would solve everything, that he didn't need to worry, that he just needed to stay alive and everything would be all right. She felt like a liar. He drank slowly, then lowered the bottle while it was still half full.
Is there a cloth anywhere?
"Hang on, I'll find one." Claire sprang back to her feet. The room was cluttered, but for all of its chaos, she couldn't find any fabric. She took up a knife and used it to rip the sleeve off her jacket, then returned to Doran and offered it to him. "Sorry, this is all I could find."
It's perfect.
He poured water on it and used it to clean his face. Claire huddled at his side as he worked. His other arm slipped around her shoulders, and for a moment, Claire was transported back to a better time. When they had been at Winterbourne, they had often sat like that in front of the fire, on the rug, legs stretched toward the flames, Doran's arm around her. She leaned her head against his chest to complete the picture. She wished she could pull back the smells from those earlier times, too. Clean linens and burning wood, instead of the blood, metal, and stress that surrounded her. Doran threw the cloth away. He'd cleared the blood off his face, but she could still see some of the stickiness in his hair. The grey shade wasn't improved. She wrapped her hands around his arm, desperately holding him against herself.
Don't be afraid.
He tilted far enough to kiss the top of her head.
We will make this work. We always do.
"We always do," she echoed. All the while, her subconscious was tracking each passing second. Doran needed rest, but the amount she could give him, a minute or two at most, seemed horribly inadequate. She stretched them as long as she dared, counting the seconds, pushing for just a little longer. A noise echoed from deeper in the building. Claire squeezed her eyes closed, praying it was just the metal complaining under the storm's strain. If Ezra had gotten out of the elevator, they were sitting ducks. The flashlight at her side gave them a little bubble of light. She could turn it off and let them take shelter in the darkness, but even then, that would only delay the inevitable. Ezra would be coming up to restore the generator. If they tried to run, they would meet him on the stairs. The stairs. That's what it sounds like. Footsteps on stairs. Hundreds of them. A deep, thrumming echo rose through the building. It was faint, but persistent. Claire squeezed Doran's hand, her breath catching. "I think we need to put the generator back on." He pushed away from the floor, staggered, and leaned against the generator.
Light, please.
She turned the flashlight around to help guide his hands. He'd taken the fuse out and carefully refit it. The machine began to whir as lights flickered on above them. Claire looked toward the display panel Ezra had shown them above the generator. 6 little lights tracked which windows were locked and which were open. 5 of the lights were green. One was red. Doran followed Claire's gaze. He took a slow breath.
We are out of time.
Claire stepped back from the machine. Her mind ran through every option, searching for some way out. The stairs, the windows, the locked rooms, the elevators. The elevators. "Can you run a little more?" she asked. He nodded, and Claire gripped his hand to keep him at her side. They moved back down the stairs, this time pushed by a fresh sense of urgency. Each second, the noises echoing from the floors below grew louder. Claire staggered to a halt on the 15th floor. At the opposite end of the carpeted hallway, the elevator doors were open. A block of light flowed out. It was a sharp contrast with the shadowed walls and red exit sign. As she watched, the doors slid closed. "Ezra?" Her voice caught. She squeezed Doran's hand, her fingers clammy, and took a step toward the elevator. "Please, listen, just for a moment. We can't afford to fight each other anymore." He couldn't have gone far. She took the hallway in slow, measured steps, passing rows of closed doors. Her nerves were raw. At the back of her mind, she kept track of the chatter rising from the stairwell. It was closing in on them, already too near. "We have to work together if we have any chance of surviving." She was nearly at the elevator, and yet there was no sign of Ezra. If he was near, he was keeping quiet. He can't have gone up. We would have met him on the stairs. Did he go down? Back to the workroom, maybe, or the labs? They were nearly at the elevator. Claire reached a shaking hand toward the buttons.
Give it back!
Claire swiveled. Ezra stood at the opposite end of the hall. He stepped out of the stairwell, gun aimed at them. "Ezra, please, we don't have much time." Claire held her hands up. "The hollows—"
The USB!
The gun shook.
You can't take it! Give it back!
I... Claire threw her mind back. It felt like an eternity ago that she'd talked to Ezra about the USB containing his code. "Do I have it? I don't remember. When was the last time I saw it?"
Give it to me!
A fleck of spittle flew from between bared teeth. He'd been pushed to his limit, to the point where madness started to seep through the cracks in his composure. Claire had felt what it was like to be pushed to that edge herself. She knew how bitter and frightening it was to teeter on that line, unsure of what was real, unable to trust her own mind. "You can come with us." She held a hand out to him. The noises in the stairwell were a cacophony. Ezra didn't show any awareness of them, though. His whole attention was directed toward Claire, eyes wild and desperate. Then the shadows in the red-tinted stairwell suddenly morphed. They began to tremble, then dance, then explode in a frenzy of movement. Claire sucked in a sharp breath. "Behind you!" Ezra turned just as the swell of hollows rose out of the stairwell in a wall of frothing limbs and gaping mouths. The gun fired, spending its final round into the crowd. If it hit any mark, it was quickly swallowed under the frenzy. Doran dragged Claire backward, away from the swarm. They hit the elevator doors. Claire reached out blindly and pressed the button. Ezra staggered back, but he'd reacted too late. The hollows poured over him. A piercing scream cut through the hallway as he disappeared under the scrabbling, chattering bodies. Claire flinched away. She didn't want to see, but she had no way to block out the sound. The scream rose, louder and louder, seemingly endless. It cracked into a raw howl, then abruptly fell silent. The noise was replaced by the endless, quiet chattering noise, huffing breaths, and the wet smack of raw flesh between teeth. The elevator doors slid open. A soft ding echoed through the hallway. A dozen heads turned to stare at Claire and Doran. Unblinking eyes shone in the light. Claire clutched Doran's hand. Together, they stepped backward into the elevator. Most of the hollows were occupied with their feast, but additional heads rose from the heap to stare at them. Claire reached one shaking hand out and selected a floor on the panel, then carefully pushed the closed doors switch. The nearest hollows began skittering forward. One of them carried a dripping mouthful of red pulp. The chattering was curious, eager. Claire mashed the closed doors button. The hollows sped up as they neared. The leader rose out of its crouch, its elongated arms stretched toward them, 18 fingers reaching for Claire's face. The doors slid closed. Bodies thudded into the barrier, fingers scratched at the metal, scrabbling along the seams as they looked for a weakness. Then the elevator began to drop, pulling them away from the swarm and their feast. Chapter 57. Claire slumped, resting her forehead on the metal doors, pulling air into oxygen-starved lungs. Doran chuckled as he rubbed her back.
You did it.
I did something. Claire lifted her head. She blinked at the panel of buttons, dazed. In her urgency to escape the hollows, she hadn't paid any attention to which button she'd pressed. She now saw she'd chosen the 8th floor. Ultimately, she suspected it didn't matter much. There would be hollows in every level of the tower by that point. Only 4 floors didn't have access from the elevator: the maintenance room, the labs, and 2 other restricted levels. The lights above the door flashed as they counted down to 8. The elevator drew to a halt. Its doors slid open with a soft ping. Mercifully, the hallway was sparsely occupied. Shapes moved through the stairwell at the opposite end. 2 stopped to stare at the elevator as the doors opened. Claire hit the closed doors button again. The hollows had only just started to move toward them before the metal barrier slid shut. We should be safe in here at least. Claire stepped back to lean against the railing on the rear wall. They won't be able to get in unless they figure out how to press the buttons. Doran sighed and sank to the floor. He'd kept pace with her, but it was clear it had taxed him. He held out his hand, and Claire sat at his side.
Rest with me a moment, then,
he said.
We have some time before we need to plan our next step.
She knew what must be going through his head. They might be safe in the elevator, but it was a limited reprieve. With no water, their lifespan could be counted in days. If they were in any other environment, they might have been able to outlast the hollows. The monsters would lose interest eventually and wander off for better pickings. But Alexis's power was still running, and the recording continued to play. As long as it broadcast its broken message, the hollows would be compelled to mill through the building. Forever. Claire leaned her head against Doran's shoulder. Her eyes burned. She tried to stay present and focused on their situation, but her mind kept sliding back to Ezra. The shock on his face as he turned toward the hollows. The screams. Doran brushed loose hair behind her ear, then ran his thumb over her cheek and down to her jaw. Claire closed her eyes and let herself sink into the touch. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I shouldn't have turned the power off. It's just made everything worse.
We were in a precarious situation. I don't know if I would have done any differently.
She chuckled. You're too forgiving. Sometimes you just need to tell me I was an idiot. He laughed as well, then pulled her a little closer. They were both dirty, the once white coats thoroughly ruined. Claire didn't care. It was good just to be close to Doran.
My darling.
He took her hand and stroked it thoughtfully.
I think we perhaps have less room for remorse in this new world. Our choices will have vastly worse consequences. Simple mistakes can result in life-altering outcomes, sometimes even death. But as the consequences grow worse, our fear must be proportionally less. Do you understand?
She frowned. Maybe. I think.
Regret had a purpose in the world. It helped us to learn from our actions, to do better next time. But now, the room for error is so small that regret offers no advantage. Do you have room to regret 5 things a day? 10? If you try to carry that weight, it will smother you. To survive, we must release ourselves from remorse.
Doran,
I am telling you this because you will need to be prepared. I have a plan.
She tilted her head back to look up at him.
It will mean you leave alone.
A spear of ice-cold panic pierced through her chest. She grabbed the hand that was holding hers. No, we either leave together or not at all.
Shh.
He kissed her forehead.
Don't be upset. I've thought this through, and it is the only option I can see. My darling, I am spent. I have no strength left to run. But I can create a distraction for you, to buy you time to get out of the city.
Distraction. He meant sacrifice. Being eaten. Using his own blood as a lure as Claire slipped away. Fear and anger swelled through her. Claire twisted around. She grabbed Doran's head with one hand on either cheek, forcing him to look at her, and snapped more loudly than she'd intended. No! That is not happening! We leave together! His eyebrows rose, and Claire was horrified to see amusement flit across his face. His hand slid around the back of her neck and pulled her in for a kiss. She didn't try to fight it.
I love you so dearly.
His lips, bitter from blood, grazed hers before he settled back against the wall.
You are brave and smart and stronger than you think. I know you can survive.
Didn't you hear me? I'm not leaving without you. Claire's voice cracked. Doran left his hand on the back of her neck, the thumb tracing small, gentle circles.
My darling Claire, you have no idea how badly I wish I could give you everything you want. But I am not able to go further.
Sitting so close to him, pressed against his body, it was easy to see the toll the last day had taken on him. His skin's awful ashen color. New creases lingered across his brows and mouth. The darkness around his eyes was deepening. She pressed one hand to his chest, and through his shirt, felt how cold he was. Tears began to fall. No, 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 I'm not leaving you.
Shh. Listen carefully. You can do this. Take the elevator to the ground floor. I will go out ahead of you, draw their attention. I will see if I can lead them away from the windows. Then you will need to escape as quickly and as quietly as you can.
Doran, stop.
Try to get to the river. I think that will be the fastest way out of the city. Take one of the boats and get to a rural road, then find a vehicle.
Stop!
You know the country well enough to get back to Winterbourne, don't you? And you know how to keep the garden running. Seal the doors. Defend yourself. It will be hard, my dear, but I know you can do it. I know you can survive.
Tears ran freely. Claire hit her fist against his chest, a weak punch that replaced her lost words. She bowed her head to rest it against his shoulder as she cried. I'm not leaving.
Shh. Shh, my darling.
Hands ran over her back.
I know this is hard. If you need time, I understand. We can sit together a while more.
Claire felt as though she were arguing against a wall. Every other time she'd fought with Doran, he'd allowed her concessions. This time, though, he wasn't even giving her a chance to object. She clung to him, terrified and sick. I'm not leaving you. I'm not living in a world without you. That's what you said to me, remember? She felt him smile into her hair.
We were never equal in that quarter. I could not take this world without you. But I think you will be all right without me. We both knew that I was just temporary.
How? She leaned back, words choking in her throat. How dare you? Doran grinned at her. Claire wanted to be furious with him. It wasn't easy when there was so much affection and adoration shining in his eyes.
You have been the best part of my life.
His thumb came up to brush tears from her cheeks.
I wish I had told you that more. I wish I had done a lot of things better. I was so occupied with trying to be the kind of man you wanted.
Crushing sadness was dousing the anger. That's why you agreed to help me get to Beth's bunker, isn't it? Because you thought you weren't good enough? Because you were trying to buy my love? The sadness in his eyes was the only answer she needed.
I am not the kind of man you would have chosen in a better world. I know that.
Doran, you idiot. She pressed her lips against his. It was a messy, frenzied, helpless kiss. She tried to push her emotions into it, trying to show him physically how she felt when her words failed. He responded, leaning into it, arms circling around her to hold her tightly. When she finally released his mouth, she leaned her forehead against his. You're the best man I've ever met. He looked aside. He never seemed able to make eye contact when he was complimented. Claire's heart ached for him. If I'd met you before the stillness, I would have thought I was luckier than I deserved. She traced her fingertips over the hard lines of his brows, down his strong nose and across his lips. If I'd met you before the stillness, I would have loved you just as deeply as I love you now. I would have loved your good parts and your flaws. I would have married you. His eyes flicked back to hers. They held a deep longing. One of his hands left her back and wormed between them to feel inside his pockets. When it came out, it held a ring. What? Claire stared at it, shocked into silence.
I found it when we passed that broken jewelry store. Not very romantic, I know. But I didn't want to give you any of the rings my family owned. I wanted something that wasn't tainted by them.
He swallowed and blinked rapidly. Doran.
I know it's foolishness. There are no priests to marry us, no one to care whether we were or not, but I just thought, perhaps.
She wrapped her hands around his and held it against her chest as fresh tears spilled over. It's not stupid. Give me the damn ring. He pulled her tightly against him. They were both laughing, giddy, and she thought he might be crying as well, though it was hard to tell. He pulled her around so she could sit in his lap properly, resting against his chest, with his chin grazing the top of her head. He placed the ring into her hand. Claire threaded it onto her shaking finger. It's beautiful. He sounded happy.
It will be something to keep. To remember me.
She shook her head. I won't need to. We'll get out of here. We'll figure it out. And when we get back to Winterbourne, we can be a proper team. Our own little family. Doran didn't respond. Uneasiness ran through Claire's stomach. She leaned back to see his expression. I'm not leaving without you. He blinked down at her, calm and loving and sad all at once.
You will need a distraction to escape the tower. There's no other choice. At least by doing this, I can ensure you get out of the city unharmed.
No.
It's all right, Claire. I am content with this choice. Please. Please don't make saying goodbye any harder than it already is. I don't think I can take it.
She shut her eyes and clung to him. I'll make it as hard as I need to. You can't force me to leave. For a moment, the elevator was silent. Claire could hear Doran's heart beating too fast under her ear, the crackling storm outside, the distant chattering of hundreds of hollows racing through the building. Doran took a deep breath and let it out slowly.
It doesn't have to be right now. You need time to accept it. I understand.
He rested his head on top of hers.
We still have a little time.
She scowled into his shirt. Doran seemed content to hold her and stroke her hair. He hummed under his breath, a slow, soothing tune. Claire sat still and let him enjoy what he seemed to believe was a victory. Her mind worked furiously. There had to be a way out, something she'd overlooked, some way past the hollows. Then all they needed to do was find a way to carry Doran until they found a safe space with food and water for him to rest. There had to be something. She ran her thumb over the ring, then turned her hand into a fist. Doran thought she just needed time to adjust to the idea. He also thought she was stubborn. He hadn't seen anything yet. Hollows screamed outside the elevator. Fingers returned to the door, scratching and prying. They stayed for several painful moments before their owners gave up and paced away. Claire wondered if there was anything left of Ezra. She had seen the creatures eat bones. By that point, he probably only existed as a stain on the carpet. The building creaked around them. She couldn't see the lightning, but she could feel the thunder. Her mind circled around their options for what felt like the 1,000th time, desperate, hunting. Their masks were lost in the office area, now overrun. They could not reach the maintenance room to turn off the power, or Ezra's laptop to turn off the recording, and the hollows would not leave as long as it played. Maybe not even then. Is Doran right? Does one of us need to die to have any hope of escape? She squeezed her eyes closed. Then we will both die here together. Doran lifted his head. For a second, Claire believed he must have heard her thoughts and prepared herself for another fight. Then he said,
"What was that?"
"What did you hear?" She blinked against the harsh elevator lights. Time had slipped away from her, and her legs were stiff from sitting.
"An engine, I think."
Claire frowned. Now that she was listening, she thought she could hear it too. Underneath the thunder and chattering hollows were sounds like an engine being revved. But that couldn't be real. The city streets were impassable. Then a car horn blared through the chilled air. That was unmistakable. Claire shot up, her pulse hammering as she stared at Doran. "Someone else came." His wide eyes stared back.
"It doesn't seem possible."
"They must have heard the radio signal." The car horn sounded again, this time loud and long. The chattering in the building grew frantic. The driver was courting danger by advertising their presence so loudly. They could probably see the unlocked window on the ground floor, she realized. With hollows running in and out of the building, they were looking for some kind of response from the tower's occupants in case the building wasn't deserted. This is how we get out. Chapter 58. Claire faced the shiny metal doors, her heart hammering. 8 floors below them was rescue. Who, what, or how, she didn't know, but they had no choice but to accept. She pulled on Doran's arm, getting him to his feet. He felt cold. As he stood, a drop of blood ran from his nose. He wiped the back of his hand across it, smearing it away. Claire clutched his arm. "We have to get to them. I know you're tired, but you have to fight a little longer." "So help me, Doran. You're getting into that car or else I'll throw myself into a horde of hollows." He shook his head, a thin smile tugging at his lips.
"Have I ever won an argument against you?"
"No, and you're not about to start now." The car horn blared again, a series of quick, sharp honks. The engine revved. Hollows had to be converging on the noise already. The stranger wouldn't stay for long. There was no time for subtlety or strategy. Claire hit the button for the foyer, and the elevator started moving. The ground floor will be full of them, and we have no masks or armor. Claire chewed her lip. Doran found her hand and pressed it. Together, they faced the doors, and Claire took a stuttering breath. "I think we'll just have to run for it." Doran nodded. The hollows would know they were coming. The pinging elevator doors would make sure of that. But if she and Doran kept their heads down and moved fast enough, they might still have some small element of surprise. The car horn sounded again, and the noise held for several seconds. It struck Claire as a final attempt to make contact, a last warning. They were already out of time. The elevator whirred as it came to a halt. Claire leaned forward, exquisitely aware that the next few seconds would save or ruin them. Doran tensed at her side. She kept a tight hold on his hand, silently telling him to stay with her. Slowly, agonizingly, the doors trundled open. Claire's first glimpse of the foyer sent tremors through her chest. It was worse than she'd expected. 24 sets of eyes turned in her direction. One mouth opened in a piercing hiss. There was no time to hesitate. The doors were wide enough, and Claire leapt forward. Doran matched her pace. She stayed close at his side and put her head down and her arm up to shield her face. Teeth locked onto her forearm. She didn't try to recoil, but barreled on, using momentum to push through. Arms grabbed at her legs. She stumbled. Doran yanked her back up. She couldn't see the windows, but she could remember which direction they had been in. Bodies were blocking the path. Too many. Far, far too many. Then light exploded through the foyer. An engine revved as the car directed its high beams toward them. Hollows hissed and screamed as they ducked away from the sudden harsh light. Claire lowered her arm. She could see the open window. It had been tilted, a huge slab of glass hanging from its hinges and leaving a narrow gap at its base. She and Doran ducked together and dove through. The vehicle's horn screamed, deafening. It wasn't a car, Claire saw. Just 20 feet from the tower was a minibus. Someone had modified it. Angled slabs of metal had been attached to the front, like a crude snowplow. The windows were covered with plywood bolted to the vehicle's metal. The door burst open. "Get in!" a voice yelled. Claire tried to look through to see the driver and had the impression of a blank, featureless face. They're wearing a mask. She tried to slow so Doran could go in first, but he shoved her ahead of himself. Arguing would have risked them both. Claire leapt up the raised front step, then turned and hauled him in behind them. The Hollows were close on their heels. He wrenched the door shut behind them. Claire and Doran stood in a narrow walkway beside the driver's seat, panting and staring at the creatures as they tried to claw their way through the door. The driver put the minibus into gear. Claire staggered as the vehicle moved and caught herself on the back of one of the seats. Their rescuer was dressed all in black and wore a beekeeper's helmet with extra fabric taped over the mesh to hide their face. Gloved hands expertly turned the wheel as the bus skidded around. Claire felt it rise onto 2 wheels and gasped. It touched down facing one of the main streets running through the city. A channel had been carved through the banks of cars, probably using the makeshift snowplow contraption to clear the road, Claire thought. "Sit down and get your seatbelt on!" the driver snapped. Claire obediently sank into a chair beside Doran. A sense of unreality washed through her. She'd heard that phrase at least 100 times from someone very dear to her. Even though the voice was muffled by the mask, the inflection felt painfully familiar. She'd grasped at unfounded hope so many times in the past days that it felt wrong to reach for it again. She looked up at Doran. He'd already fastened his buckle and watched her, brows raised in a silent question. Claire turned back to the driver, her heart fluttering like a frantic bird. "Beth?" They hit one of the cars on the side of the road. The minibus kept moving, but the jolt was enough to nearly throw Claire out of her seat. She grabbed the chair ahead of herself with a grunt. The driver twisted around and pulled their mask off. The face underneath held scars Claire had never seen before, but the tilt of the eyebrows, the fire in the eyes, and the exasperated angle of the lips were all beautifully, wonderfully familiar. "So help me, Claire, put your seatbelt on before I strangle you with it. Okay." Claire knew she was grinning like an idiot. She also knew she was crying. She couldn't stop. Numb hands hunted for the belt and dragged it into its lock as Beth slammed on the accelerator, taking them away from Alexis Tower and out of the city. This has been Secrets in the Dark by Darcy Coates, narrated by Angela Daw, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 2020 by Darcy Coates. Production copyright 2020 by Darcy Coates. All rights reserved.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.